In the winter of 1887, a single photograph arrived at the Charleston courthouse that would unsettle investigators for decades. It depicted 17 barefoot children, ages 3 to 16, standing in the snow outside a dilapidated cabin, deep in the remote hollows of West Virginia. Their emaciated frames and vacant eyes were haunting enough. But what truly disturbed authorities were the iron shackles clamped around their ankles and the fact that the Greylock family who lived in that cabin had only ever reported 4 children to the state. The identities of the other 13 had been systematically erased, their births unrecorded, and their existence denied by every adult in the isolated mountain enclave. This was no accident. It was part of a chilling pattern that hinted at something far darker hidden in the Appalachian wilds. Before we dive deeper into the Greylock family's horrifying legacy, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. We uncover America's buried horrors, so tell us what state you're watching from. Let's see how far these forgotten stories travel. The infamous photograph was just the beginning of a mystery that would expose one of the most organized cases of child exploitation in American history. Bone Creek Hollow, tucked deep within the unforgiving terrain of the West Virginia mountains, had been sealed off from the world by nature itself, its treacherous paths rendered impassable during harsh winters. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, lay 27 miles away through winding trails that only locals could navigate without disappearing. In this isolated world, generations of families lived by their own rules, governed by blood ties, silence, and a fierce loyalty to the idea that what happened in the hollow stayed there. The Greylocks had been the first to claim the land's richest bottomlands in 1834, when Jeremiah Greylock led his wife and children through the Cumberland Gap during America's westward expansion. But unlike others chasing fortune, Jeremiah wanted isolation. To him, distance from the law, the church and society wasn't a drawback. It was freedom. The hollow offered fertile land, fresh water, abundant game, and most importantly, complete independence from oversight. By 1887, his grandson Ezekiel Greylock had turned that legacy into something far more sinister. He ruled not just his immediate family, but a tightly controlled network of kin-hired men and so-called wards children with no documented past and no legal protection. The Greylock homestead had become a fortress, where Ezekiel's word was final, his punishments brutal, and his control absolute. Tall, wiry, and sharp-eyed Ezekiel masked his calculating nature behind a backwoods dialect and threadbare clothes, but beneath the facade was a mind that operated with ruthless precision. His wife, Martha Greylock, born Martha Kellerman from a neighboring hollow, was equally hardened, a woman shaped by 3 decades of isolation and silence. Their 4 acknowledged children were raised in this same mold. Samuel, the eldest, mirrored his father's cold intellect. Rebecca, at 17, had already mastered quiet cruelty. The 14-year-old twins, Jacob and Jeremiah, understood that survival depended on strict obedience and never speaking of what they saw. But these 4 were only the tip of the iceberg. The Greylocks' real influence came from their ability to collect and exploit children whose disappearances went unnoticed. In an era when child mortality was high and records often unreliable, they created their own shadow society within the hollow, free of scrutiny, consequence, or compassion. Their method was simple, yet devastating. Struggling families from nearby hollows sometimes turned to Ezekiel in desperation, offering their children under the practice of binding out a legal but loosely regulated system where children were sent to wealthier households in exchange for food, shelter, and basic education. But Bone Creek Hollow was no safe haven. Once inside, these children vanished into a world of forced labor and silence. Others arrived through even darker means, orphaned by mining disasters, disease or poverty, or simply abandoned at remote churches. They came through a network of corrupt county officials, itinerant preachers, and greedy neighbors who exchanged human lives for small bribes. Once in the hollow, these children ceased to exist in the eyes of the outside world. The Greylock's empire thrived on that invisibility, on the mountain's silence, and the complicity of those too scared or too distant to intervene. By the winter of 1887, the Greylock family's hidden system had been operating undisturbed for over 20 years. Officially, the household included just 6 members. In reality, 21 people lived within the compound, 17 of them children trapped in a world of endless labor, meager food, and routine cruelty that would have horrified even the hardest souls of that brutal era. The photograph that eventually unveiled their crimes was never meant to be evidence. In December of that year, a traveling photographer named Henry Peaton was passing through mountain communities offering portraits for the modest price of 50 cents, a rare chance for remote families to preserve their likenesses for generations. During a stop in Cedar Ridge, he heard rumors about the Greylocks. Locals spoke of Ezekiel Greylock with reluctant respect, noting his unusual productivity and cash-only transactions despite the region's unforgiving terrain. Curious and hoping for a profitable commission, Peaton set out for Bone Creek Hollow on December 15th. What he found defied all his expectations. Instead of a rustic log cabin, the Greylock homestead was a fortified compound, a series of well-built structures surrounding a central yard. The main house, made from perfectly hewn chestnut logs, featured glass windows, multiple rooms, and a stone chimney that spoke of wealth and permanence. Around it stood a large barn, various workshops, and dormitory-like buildings that felt unnervingly institutional for a family farm. Then there were the children. Ezekiel introduced 4 of them. His official offspring, each dressed neatly, standing straight, and speaking only when spoken to. But as Peaton set up his equipment in the courtyard, he began to notice something strange. Gaunt figures darting through the shadows between buildings. Their clothes were ragged, their movements quick and cautious. They never approached, never lingered in plain view. When Peaton asked about them, Ezekiel's reply was smooth and practiced. They were orphans, hired hands, or distant kin taken in out of charity, common enough explanations in the isolated mountains. But as Peaton adjusted his lens, a sudden disturbance shattered the illusion. From one of the outer buildings came a clamor, footsteps, pounding, urgent shouting, and unmistakably the metallic rattle of chains. Moments later, several of the hidden children burst into the open. Peaton got his first clear look. These were no relatives or temporary laborers. Their cheeks were hollow, their limbs skeletal. They wore tattered clothing more suitable for burial than work. And around their ankles, clearly visible in the bright winter sun, were iron shackles linked by short chains. The chaos that followed burned itself into Peaton's mind. Martha Greylock's voice, sharp and merciless, cracked through the air. Samuel and Rebecca sprang into action, chasing the fleeing children with brutal efficiency, leather straps in hand. The mask Ezekiel wore for visitors dropped instantly. His face turned cold, calculating, as he barked commands to restore order and secure the workers. Amid the confusion, Peaton acted on instinct. His camera, already positioned for the portrait, was ready. Without hesitation, he triggered the shutter. The result? A stark image of 17 shackled children frozen in time, standing in the snow outside a house of hidden horrors. Their eyes were hollow, their fear unmistakable. Ezekiel immediately realized what had happened. He demanded the photographic plate. Peaton, heart racing, lied. He said the exposure had failed and he needed to prepare a new one. He knew he had just captured something monstrous, proof of a secret the mountains had kept for too long. That fleeting moment of chaos bought Henry Peaton just enough time. While pretending to prepare a second exposure, he secretly secured the original plate, the one capturing the shackled children. Then, with shaking hands, he produced a new image, a polished family portrait showing only the 4 recognized Greylock children, posed stiffly in front of the main house. Ezekiel examined it, nodded, and seemed convinced that any risk had been averted. Peyton left Bone Creek Hollow before nightfall, 2 photographic plates hidden in his case, one a facade of civility, the other a raw glimpse into something monstrous. 3 days later, in the quiet of his hotel room in Cedar Ridge, he developed the images. As the second plate came into view under the chemical wash, the children's faces emerged with haunting clarity, shackled, hollow-eyed, terrified. They seemed to stare straight through the paper, their silent agony demanding a justice Peyton wasn't sure he could provide. In 1887, photographs were still viewed with suspicion in many rural areas. Legal protections for children were minimal. And in the eyes of the law, the word of a respected white landowner like Ezekiel Greylock outweighed that of a traveling photographer. Peyton now faced an impossible choice: remain silent and live with the knowledge of what he had seen, or risk everything to expose horrors most people would prefer not to believe. His decision didn't come quickly. For 3 weeks after returning to Charleston, he said nothing. The incriminating plate remained locked in his studio safe while he wrestled with doubt, fear, and moral obligation. West Virginia's legal system at the time was ill-equipped to deal with crimes of this magnitude, especially in isolated, tightly knit mountain communities. Child labor was common. Informal adoptions were legal. Abuse, unless extreme, was rarely prosecuted. As Peyton began cautiously investigating, he realized the Greylocks weren't just exploiting a legal gray area, they were protected by it. Worse still, Ezekiel Greylock wasn't just some hidden tyrant in the hills. He had influence. When Peyton brought his concerns to Charleston's County Sheriff James Rutledge, the reaction was tepid at best. Rutledge listened politely, but highlighted the challenges: remote terrain, unreliable access, the cultural isolation of the region. But there was something else in his tone, something evasive. Pressed further, the sheriff reluctantly admitted that Greylock had been a helpful source for law enforcement over the years. He'd provided useful information on bootleggers, escaped convicts, and other criminal activities in the mountain regions. To some, he was an asset. That revelation cast everything in a darker light. If Ezekiel had protected status with law enforcement, who else might be complicit? Digging into court records and found an unsettling pattern. Over the past 15 years, Ezekiel had formalized dozens of child placements, adoptions, apprenticeships, guardianships, all filed correctly and supported with convincing paperwork. But when Peyton tried to trace these children's whereabouts, they had simply vanished. No school records, no employment history, no marriages or deaths. Just a legal entry followed by total silence. He uncovered another layer: financial ties. At least 2 local judges and a court clerk had received significant loans from Greylock loans that conveniently coincided with favorable court decisions. These weren't just isolated acts of corruption. They were part of a deliberate system. Ezekiel provided a service quietly absorbing orphans and unwanted children, and in return, officials ensured he wasn't questioned. Even the churches weren't clean. Several local ministers had referred children to the Greylocks, believing they were helping to place the impoverished with a devout and stable family. The Greylocks were well regarded for their tithes, their moral appearance, and their discipline. To outsiders, they were model Christians. To the children within the hollow, they were jailers. Peyton's slow, methodical inquiries eventually led him to older residents of nearby communities. Some, when coaxed carefully, admitted that in years past, families had sent children to work with the Greylocks, especially during times of famine, illness, or crop failure. And almost always these elders recited the same story: the children had done well, moved to cities, married, prospered. But none of them could name a single child. None had seen one return. It became painfully clear. Peyton wasn't just up against one corrupt family. He was uncovering an entire social mechanism built to disappear inconvenient children and absolve everyone involved of guilt. Bone Creek Hollow was a blind spot, one deliberately constructed by layers of bureaucracy, tradition, and willful ignorance. The children in his photograph didn't just fall through the cracks of society, they had been pushed. And most chilling of all this wasn't new. As Peyton examined Deed's old court filings and oral histories, he began to realize that the current Greylocks had inherited this system. What Ezekiel controlled now had been seeded by his father and grandfather. Each generation had refined the operation, perfecting a self-sustaining cycle of control, secrecy, and exploitation hidden in plain sight. Long before the infamous photograph, before Peyton's investigation began to unravel the Greylock legacy, the seeds of this horror had been sown by the family patriarch himself, Jeremiah Greylock. He was the man who first led his kin into Bone Creek Hollow and arrived in West Virginia with an unusually large number of children listed as bound servants or apprentices. Census records from the 1840s and 1850s showed a telling pattern. The number of children in the Greylock household fluctuated frequently, with names appearing and vanishing between counts. It was clear even then that something was already in motion, a system quietly evolving beneath the gaze of inattentive clerks and rural officials. More unsettling still were scattered records from neighboring families that hinted at what became of children who didn't meet the Greylocks' expectations. Several households reported young boys and girls who had allegedly run off shortly after being placed in the family's care. But these disappearances always followed the same suspicious template. They occurred in the dead of winter, when the surrounding terrain was nearly impassable, and the children left behind every personal belonging, including treasured keepsakes that no one would abandon by choice. The mountains offered the perfect cover for making inconvenient children disappear. Bone Creek Hollow sat in a landscape riddled with deep caves, disused mine shafts, and plunging ravines, places where a body could be swallowed forever. Over the years, local hunters and trappers occasionally reported strange findings, fragments of bone, scraps of worn clothing. But in a world where wild predators were common and tragedy was routine, such discoveries were written off as accidents or the work of wolves. By the fall of 1888, Peyton had amassed a disturbing archive testimony. Court filings, census anomalies, and his haunting photograph, all pointing to a vast intergenerational system of child exploitation. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Not when the criminal enterprise in question had thrived for over 50 years, protected by social apathy, official complicity, and a culture that preferred to look away. The breakthrough came unexpectedly from Ohio. As word of Peyton's inquiries spread through informal channels that connected mountain families across state lines, it reached a woman living in Cincinnati under the name Sarah Miller. Her real name was Sarah Kellerman. Born in 1851, she had grown up just a few ridges away from the Greylocks. When her parents died of typhoid in 1863, Sarah, then 12, and her two younger brothers were placed in Ezekiel Greylock's custody under what appeared to be a legal guardianship. What followed were 6 years of horror. When Peyton met Sarah in December 1888, he encountered a woman whose memory was sharpened by survival. Her testimony didn't just confirm his suspicions, it expanded them. The children in his photograph, she explained, were only one layer of the Greylock machinery. What had developed in Bone Creek Hollow was not merely a system of child labor, but a coldly calculated program that combined psychological manipulation, physical weakening, and what she chillingly described as human breeding. According to Sarah, the shackles were reserved for the defiant, the ones who ran or resisted. Most children didn't need chains. They were kept compliant through subtler tactics. Starvation left them too weak to flee. Gaslighting convinced them they were worthless, unwanted, and better off in the hollow than the world beyond. The system rewarded obedience with small comforts, extra rations, slightly warmer clothing, while punishing disobedience with isolation, public humiliation, or violent beatings. This structure kept the children competing against one another, rather than bonding or rebelling. Even the physical layout of the Greylock homestead had been designed for control. What Peyton had assumed were simple dormitories were in truth disguised prisons. The sleeping quarters had no windows and doors that locked from the outside. Children were deliberately separated from their siblings and closest companions to prevent emotional bonds. Every aspect of life in the compound, from mealtimes to work shifts, was engineered to fracture solidarity and maintain total dependency on their captors. Food was used as a weapon. Meals were portioned just enough to sustain labor, but not enough to allow escape. Hunger was constant and consuming. Sarah recalled children scrapping over discarded crumbs, their survival instincts overriding any sense of community or shared suffering. It was a system designed not just to exploit, but to break the will. Yet perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when Sarah described the Greylock's long-term plans. They did not simply discard children once they aged out of usefulness. There was something more methodical, more sinister beneath the surface, an intention that went beyond exploitation and into generational control. The Greylocks didn't just exploit children, they bred them. Over decades, they developed a systematic program designed to create new generations of laborers who would never know a world outside Bone Creek Hollow. Teenage girls among the bound children were routinely forced into sexual relationships with older boys or young men. Any children born from these coerced pairings were not considered sons or daughters. They were property Greylocks from birth. These second-generation captives born into isolation and ignorance were considered the most valuable workers in the system. They had no memories of freedom, no awareness of their stolen humanity, no knowledge of legal rights or family outside the hierarchy they were born into. Many were kept deliberately illiterate, fed lies about the world beyond the mountains, and psychologically conditioned to see the Hollow as the only safe place they'd ever know. Even if given the chance to flee, they couldn't imagine escape because they couldn't imagine anything else. Sarah Kellerman had escaped only because she'd arrived old enough to remember another life. She still carried fragments of her childhood books, Love Safety, enough to recognize the Greylock compound as an aberration, not a home. Her escape in 1869 was no desperate dash. It was methodical. She hid food, studied mountain trails, waited for the chaos of a winter storm to cover her tracks. She ran through the snow with the memory of her parents' faces in her heart and her younger brother's screams echoing in her ears, because she had seen what happened to those who didn't make it. The Greylocks didn't quietly dispose of children they deemed unfit, those too weak to work, too defiant to break, or simply no longer useful. They executed them publicly, theatrically. Sarah remembered the exact moment her younger brother Thomas was caught trying to wave down a passing traveler. The punishment was immediate. He was dragged before the other children, screaming, and thrown into the freezing waters of Bone Creek. The ice swallowed him whole. His body never surfaced. Other executions followed similar patterns. Beatings, drownings, strangulations, all staged in front of the surviving children. They weren't just murders. They were messages. This is what happens when you disobey. The purpose was terror. The result was total control. But it wasn't just the cruelty that built the Greylock empire. It was profit. Sarah's testimony revealed an operation far more complex than a backwoods prison camp. The family's prosperity, long admired by neighbors, was built on a network of criminal activity, theft, fraud, and what modern law would label human trafficking. Children with special talents or appearances were sold to criminal enterprises in distant cities. Some disappeared into forced labor camps, others into brothels. The Greylocks had also mastered the art of predation, disguised as generosity. They targeted vulnerable families on the brink, those suffering crop failures, illness, or poverty. They offered loans, food, crop sharing arrangements. Over time, those favors became chains. The Greylocks acquired land, livestock, and eventually the children themselves. They enriched themselves while maintaining the fiction of Christian charity and mountain modesty. Even more horrifying was Sarah's revelation that the Hollow wasn't an isolated evil. She had spoken with children who described other places, other families, other names, but the same tactics. Remote valleys, hidden communities, systems nearly identical in their structure and savagery. Bone Creek Hollow was not an aberration. It was part of something larger, an unspoken network of rural slavery stretching across the Appalachian spine. By the close of 1888, Henry Peaton realized he was no longer documenting a tragedy. He was uncovering a hidden history of generational abuse, possibly the most organized and protected case of child exploitation in the nation's past. But the same elements that made the operation successful also shielded it from justice. The crimes were old, the paper trails vague, the witnesses terrified. Too many officials had been bribed or blackmailed. Too many institutions had chosen comfort over confrontation. Still armed with Sarah's testimony and the damning photograph, Peaton pressed forward. Throughout the early months of 1889, he worked feverishly to build a case that could break through the rot. But then the past reached out. In February 1889, Sarah received a letter at her home in Cincinnati. The handwriting was uneven but deliberate. The message brief but chilling. "We know where you are, Sarah Kellerman. We know about your husband, Charles Miller, and your daughter Emma. Mountain justice has a long memory, and family debts are never forgotten. Some secrets should stay buried in the hollow where they belong." It was signed, not with a name, but with a drawing, a crude hand-sketched mountain laurel, the Greylock family's emblem. The message shattered any illusion of distance or safety. The Greylocks had found her. Their reach extended far beyond West Virginia. And if they could find Sarah, what about others? Had other survivors been traced, silenced, brought back? Peaton acted immediately. He arranged for Sarah and her family to be relocated to a secure location. Meanwhile, he searched for the breach. How had they found her? The answer came from Ohio public records. Birth and marriage registries had been accessed by individuals claiming to be relatives, searching for a long-lost family member. Small payments accompanied the requests, just enough to loosen lips. These clerks, unaware of the danger, had unknowingly exposed Sarah's new identity, address, and even her daughter's name. Peaton's heart sank. If the Greylocks had the ability to track escapees across state lines, then his entire investigation might be compromised. His movements, his questions, his sources. That fear was confirmed when he returned to his Charleston studio in March. Nothing had been stolen, nothing destroyed. But his desk drawers were clearly disturbed. Papers were rearranged, notes moved. Someone had been there, and they'd been careful, too careful. The Greylocks were watching. Nothing was missing from Peaton's Charleston studio, but everything had been touched. Papers were rearranged, files rifled through, and the safe, once secure, had been opened without a single mark of forced entry. On his desk, a single Greylock flower had been left behind. Its delicate white petals were already curling in the warm air, turning brown at the edges. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a message, a promise, and a threat. Just when it seemed the horrors of Bone Creek Hollow had reached their peak, the terror escalated. If you're still watching, share this video with a friend who craves the darkest corners of history. Hit that like button to support our research and subscribe to make sure you don't miss the next chapter of this unfolding nightmare. Let's uncover what happened next. In the spring of 1889, strange reports began emerging from the mountains. Travelers passing near Bone Creek Hollow described unsettling sights, groups of men moving through the forest at night. The sound of construction echoing from the valley, and more armed guards than ever before patrolling the approaches to the Greylock land. Local merchants noticed a disturbing shift. The Greylocks were stockpiling provisions, not for farming but for siege, canned goods, ammunition, medical supplies, lumber, and iron. Meanwhile, those who had dared to assist Peyton's investigation began experiencing threats of their own. A former county clerk who had confessed to accepting bribes from the Greylocks watched his barn burn to the ground under suspicious circumstances. A store owner who had spoken of the family's strange purchases found his shop ransacked not for money, but for ledgers and letters. A preacher who had voiced doubts about the charity of the Greylocks received visitors posing as missionaries. Men who asked probing questions about his wife, his children, his routines. It was clear the Greylocks weren't just a corrupt family in a backwoods hollow. They were a well-organized syndicate capable of surveillance sabotage and calculated violence across state lines. They had money, they had muscle, and they had allies in powerful places. Even Peyton's growing cache of evidence drew the attention of federal authorities, but not the help he'd hoped for. Instead, federal marshals questioned him. Why was a Charleston photographer meddling in areas that didn't concern him? Why was he threatening to disrupt relationships with informants that federal law enforcement had found useful for years? The truth became undeniable and unbearable. The Greylocks had been tolerated, even protected, because they were useful. For years they had fed federal agents information about moonshiners, fugitives, and rival criminal networks operating in the wilderness. In exchange, their own crimes had been ignored. They weren't just being overlooked. They were part of the system. Peyton's mission had grown from uncovering abuse to challenging an institutionally protected evil. But before he could act further, word reached him of another disappearance. Then another, and another. 3 more children vanished from remote families in the spring of 1889, each under circumstances that echoed previous Greylock abductions. The family wasn't hiding. They were expanding. Time was running out. Then on the night of May 15, 1889, everything changed. A 14-year-old boy named Michael Brennan staggered into the sheriff's office in Cedar Ridge after a 27-mile journey through unforgiving terrain. He had escaped Bone Creek Hollow, but unlike others who had fled, Michael had never known any other life. He was born in the Hollow, one of the second-generation captives bred for servitude. His arrival caused a sensation. He was emaciated, scarred, and terrified, but determined. He carried hand-drawn maps of the compound, lists of names and ages of children still in captivity, and most damning of all tokens: locks of hair, trinkets, carved initials, personal items taken from the dead. Each one corresponded with real missing persons reports from across multiple counties. Michael's body bore the truth: burns, poorly healed fractures, scars from shackles and whips. But his mind held the key. He remembered everything. He described the layout of the hollow in chilling detail. The placement of shacks, workyards, punishment cells. He explained how food was rationed, how children were ranked, how siblings were separated. He named corrupt judges, bribed sheriffs, and ghost children who had vanished without a trace. And then came the most horrifying revelation of all. Michael had been one of the trusted Hollow-born. Literate and obedient, he had been tasked with assisting in the family's record-keeping. What the Greylocks didn't know was that he had been secretly documenting everything for years: the names of children sold to other groups, those executed for defiance, and the dates of planned purges. The Greylocks were preparing to erase everything. Michael had overheard Ezekiel himself discussing the plan. With scrutiny growing and too many questions being asked, they would kill every remaining child in the Hollow. The deaths would be blamed on an outbreak, sickness, fire, a tragic accident. The bodies would be burned, the records destroyed, and the family would relocate west, where federal oversight was even weaker. Michael knew he had to escape, and somehow he did. With his testimony and evidence, Sheriff Rutledge could no longer look away. He assembled a force, but secrecy was essential. Informants were everywhere. Only outsiders could be trusted. A small team of federal marshals vetted civilian volunteers and a handful of loyal deputies was formed. The raid began at dawn on June 3, 1889. What they found exceeded even Michael's most horrifying accounts. The Hollow was a fully operational prison camp, complete with workshops, holding cells, punishment pits, and graveyards. 47 children and young adults were found alive, most in critical condition. Beneath the compound, mass graves revealed generations of victims. Journals and ledgers documented the acquisition, control, and disposal of children as if they were livestock. But even that wasn't the full truth. Among the papers were letters, hundreds of them, linking the Greylocks to other operations across 7 states. Sales, trades, transfers, training manuals for discipline. Advice on corrupting judges, names of officials, names of families. This was not a family secret. It was a network. And yet the final confrontation was not a shootout or a chase. The Greylocks were waiting. Ezekiel, now in his 60s, stood calmly at the head of the compound. Dressed in Sunday best, he welcomed the authorities like guests. With unnerving composure, he presented what he claimed were government authorizations, signed papers, fake seals, names of federal officers he said had sanctioned everything, and he almost succeeded. But Michael Brennan was standing beside the marshals, and when they turned to him, he did not waver. He pointed to every room, named every captive, matched every dead child to a name, a face, a family. The lies unraveled in real time. And Ezekiel Greylock, the man who had built an empire on suffering, was finally silent. Michael Brennan's intimate knowledge of the Greylock compound proved invaluable. As investigators scoured Bone Creek Hollow, he guided them to hidden records, buried caches, and secret passageways that contradicted every word of Ezekiel Greylock's carefully constructed lies. Most damning of all, Michael's testimony revealed the Greylocks' apparent cooperation had been nothing more than a ruse, an effort to buy time and destroy the most incriminating evidence. Search teams uncovered barrels of lamp oil hidden throughout key buildings, rigged for rapid ignition. It was clear the family had planned to burn the compound to the ground the moment law enforcement turned their backs. Even more horrifying, several of the captive children had been dosed with what appeared to be poison during their morning meal. An act of cold calculation intended to silence witnesses before they could speak. The mass poisoning was caught just in time to save most of the victims, but it laid bare the depth of the Greylocks' cruelty. Faced with inevitable justice, they chose not to repent, but to eliminate their secrets by any means necessary. The trials that followed the raid on Bone Creek Hollow became some of the most significant criminal proceedings in West Virginia history, but the path to justice was long and lined with revelations as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Over the course of 3 years, prosecutors unraveled a network of systemic failure that stretched far beyond the Greylock property. The case exposed decades of collusion, negligence, and willful blindness at every level of local governance. Ezekiel Greylock and his immediate family were ultimately convicted of crimes ranging from kidnapping and fraud to murder and conspiracy. But they did not fall alone. 12 county officials, 6 judges, and numerous law enforcement officers were also implicated, charged with helping cover up the family's crimes or directly facilitating them. The trials shattered the political infrastructure across 4 counties and sparked a nationwide reckoning over child protection in rural America. But justice wasn't clean. For the rescued children, there was no easy return to normalcy. Many had no legal identity, no birth records, no surviving families. They had been stolen so young that most remembered nothing of the world beyond the Hollow. Even for those who could be identified, reunification often proved impossible. Years of captivity had inflicted deep psychological scars. Many children could not adapt to life outside the compound. Some required permanent institutional care. Others simply vanished, drifting back into the mountains, into obscurity, into silence. Michael Brennan, the boy whose courage shattered a system of horror, became both a symbol of survival and a vessel of tragedy. He eventually built a life in Pennsylvania, working as a teacher and child welfare advocate. But he remained haunted by guilt for those he couldn't save, for the years he spent in silence, for the lives extinguished before help could arrive. The photograph that started it, all the image of 17 shackled children in the snow, was entered into evidence during the trials. Today it hangs in the West Virginia State Archives. It has become one of the most powerful images in American legal history. A frozen moment in time that forced a nation to confront the evil festering behind closed doors. It shattered the myth that such cruelty was only possible elsewhere, and demanded that Americans see what was hidden in plain sight. The Bone Creek Hollow case revealed a sobering truth. This was not an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper rot of systems, vulnerable to corruption, of rural isolation used as a shield for abuse, and of societal apathy toward the most vulnerable. Dozens of children listed in Greylock records were never recovered. They had been sold, transferred, or simply erased. Some disappeared into distant territories where no one would ever look. Others were likely absorbed into similar operations scattered across Appalachia. In the years that followed, new legislation was passed. Oversight for child placement agencies was strengthened. Penalties for neglect and corruption were increased. But enforcement remained uneven, especially in the remote regions where such horrors had taken root. Too many questions were left unanswered, too many graves unmarked, and too many victims still lost to history. The Greylock estate was abandoned after the trials. Nature crept back in. Roofs collapsed. Trees broke through floorboards. Locals stayed away, not out of superstition, but out of shame. Bone Creek Hollow became silent again. Not the silence of complicity, but the heavy silence of reckoning. Sarah Kellerman, whose testimony had been pivotal in bringing the case to trial, never fully recovered from the trauma of reliving her captivity. But she refused to disappear into the shadows. She spent the rest of her life helping missing children's organizations, driven by guilt, grief, and an unrelenting desire to prevent others from suffering what she had. Her advocacy contributed to the formation of one of the first systematic missing persons databases in U.S. law enforcement. In the end, the Greylock case became more than a crime story. It was a mirror, a challenge, a warning. It forced America to ask how many Bone Creek Hollows had been ignored, how many more children had suffered unheard and unseen behind walls of respectability and masks of charity. And yet, for all its darkness, this story is also one of resilience. The photograph that Henry Peaton risked his life to preserve did not gather dust. It bore witness, it demanded justice, it spoke for the voiceless, and it found in a photographer and a runaway boy the courage to bring an empire of cruelty to its knees. The children in that image waited over 50 years for someone to see them, for someone to believe them. They waited for a world willing to confront the horror it had allowed to grow in its blind spots. And finally, someone did. What do you think of this story? Could such cruelty still hide in isolated communities today? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this tale gave you chills, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true crime stories that history tried to bury. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.